everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Bottom Line. I'm your host, Lauren Kalil. Our show is brought to you by Whoop. Make sure to check out the description below to join our team or sign up to get a free strap and an extra month's membership with our link. On today's show, I'm joined by Brian Friend to give us our first take on the new CrossFit documentary, Fittest on Earth Next Gen. Brian, let's first discuss the title here. Before watching this doc, you made some comments that you thought calling this one Next Gen was a bit premature. Now that you've watched it in full, did your mind change at all?
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt about it. Like the next generation in CrossFit is 100% coming, and I think that the problem is what Mariah Moore, who's the director of the movie's intention was with creating that title, was not necessarily understood up front, and so I didn't, I was confused by that. It wasn't suggestive that this movie is about the next generation of CrossFit athletes, and it shouldn't be, because if you look back at that year and you look at the athletes who were relevant in terms of the winning the thing and competing on the podium, there weren't really any next gen athletes in that conversation. All Justin Medeiros being the exception as obviously in that group from an age perspective, but he was on the podium the year before, as were all 6 of the podium athletes. And when you're talking about people like Andy Thorisdottir, Pat Vellner, Brent Fikowski, and Tia Claire Toomey, who are the driving point, athletes in this movie and of that year, that's not next gen. I think that the next gen title was a great idea. I just think that and even after watching, I think that they jumped the gun there, and that the next year, or possibly even the year after, would have been the better timing for that title.
Okay, and something else that you had brought up, again, before you would watch the documentary, was the presence or maybe lack there of presence when it comes to Dave Castro. Shortly after you had put a post on social media, you then said, I've gained a little bit more insight about this. Maybe I jumped the gun. What are your thoughts now after talking to some people, getting a better feel, and then, of course, watching the film?
Yeah, I mean, Dave addressed this in his weekly review of not too long after that, and he mentioned me by name in it and said some really nice things, which was nice of him, but also just allowed people to get the perspective from his end about why he wasn't so present in this movie. And it's basically that he doesn't, this is in line with who he is he felt like it was too much about him, and he mentions that he thought that the format for these movies was becoming fairly repetitive, and he was a big part of that, and he wanted to pull out of that a little bit. I think that in talking to the people who made the movie and also listening to what Dave had to say, finding the balance of what he wanted with what they needed in order to include. I mean, he is a very important part of the sport, having been programmer that year. Was maybe a delicate balance for them to find, and it sounds like a couple of years for them to come to an understanding about. But overall, he just didn't want to be in the movie too much, talking about the programming and the events. And it seems like I'm inferring a little bit that he would just prefer it to be more focused on the athletes and what they did with the tasks that they were given. That's what you get in this movie. However, if you still are someone who wants to see what the perspective is from the CrossFit Games side of things, we get that. And we get that in the form of Adrian Bosman, who is also the director of sport now. And the kind of cool thing about having Adrian do that is obviously he's been intimately involved with the games programming, usually there with Dave in the testing format and the refining of all those workouts. So he knows, as well as Dave does, what's the meaning for this test, what is the purpose of it, and can put things in context. But if you listen closely to some of the things he says, which I would encourage people to do, he does offer potentially a little bit of insight into what his era of programming for the CrossFit Games could offer that's slightly different than what Dave brought for so many years. So that's a little added bonus or nuance that I necessarily wasn't expecting to get inside the mind of the new programmer for the CrossFit Games.
When we look at the documentary as a whole, and you're looking at the athletes and whether it's screen time, storylines, or just the athletes as a whole, do you think that there was a good balance between what we saw from the quote unquote next generation and then the OGs?
So Mariah's kind of idea here was to open the movie with a question. How relevant is this next generation of athletes in the current CrossFit landscape? And then tap into that question a few times throughout the movie and ultimately conclude with another voiceover, both of which are done by Patrick Cummings. They're very well written and well delivered on his end.
Oh, yeah.
To kind of, answer that question at the end. I think that there could have been maybe a one or two spots in there to check in with him again. I think over the course of a 2-hour movie to have the opening and then the closing, I'd forgotten about that by that point. But, there may have been a couple of key moments where you could have inserted another thought or voiceover from Cummings that could have just kind of tied it together more and kept that theme or that question relevant throughout the movie. Additionally, there is a big host of athletes that are next gen. A lot of them didn't make the games last year, but did this year. But even of the ones that did, a majority of the focus was on Medeiros. Next most was probably Mal. After that, you had a little bit from, I feel like I'm blanking on someone here, Emma Carey and Guy Maieros. So those are the four, probably Justin, Mal, Guy, and then Emma, who get the most screen time. But I think that there was possibly an opportunity to highlight a few other athletes that fit into that category that was totally missed out on. Both Gabby McGowan and Haley Adams finished inside the top 6, which is better than Guy, Mal, and Emma did. They're all around the same age. They're still both very young. They have been the forerunners of the next generation for women in the sport. And if you didn't know who they were, you might not even realize they were at the games last year because there's very, very little of them. For the men, it's, there's a little bit of a debate about what qualifies as a next gen, but Jason Hopper is the same age as Justin Medeiros. He was a huge story last year leading into the games, having beat Medeiros and one of the best of all time, Scott Panchik, in the semifinals. He didn't do very well at the games, which is okay. I mean, still made the top 20, which is impressive. But again, if you don't know who Jason Hopper is, you wouldn't barely even know he's in the film. And if you're a Jason Hopper fan, you'll be really disappointed with his percentage of inclusion in the film, considering that the title's about the next gen. He's in that class. He's a guy that Justin Medeiros is very aware of that's coming. That Medeiros considers a threat still. So I think that if you're going to have that as the title, then there was probably more that could have been offered on that front.
When we look at somebody who actually did get a lot of screen time, there was a 6-minute section of Annie Thorisdottir where we were taken through her journey from her first CrossFit Games to standing on top of the podium, and then all of those struggles that she had with her pregnancy, but ultimately took third at the games. How important do you think it was to highlight such a big section of Annie in such depth, especially knowing that she's been in the sport for a decade?
Longer than that, yeah. She's, I think one of the really highlights of the film for me was the emotional components, and certainly Annie's story is one of those things. There were some other emotional components surrounding the cut lines and some injuries that I think we're going to talk about in a minute. But in the case of Annie, this is one of those performances. Given what she's done in the sport, what she went through in that time off to have her daughter, and then to come back and perform like that, it's one of those things that'll live on forever. It could be a story for the record books that people 20 and 50 years from now, if this thing keeps going, will always look back to and say, well, Annie, she made us believe that this was possible again.
Yeah.
She did that early on in her career, in the middle of her career, and now towards the end of her career, potentially. So I think that it was important to include that. It has been highlighted on other media sources throughout the year, but to have it in the movie there makes sense, especially with what she ended up accomplishing that year and what she means just for women in general around the world in the sport, that it would have been a miss to not have that focus on her.
So you mentioned possibly injuries during the sport. Obviously, the biggest one last year was Brooke Wells. If you talk to people in the space, it's hard to get a real feel of what do people really want, because you look at these other sports and how they cover injuries. And I think that CrossFit is still doing it a little bit different because we are such a tight knit community, ecosystem, whatever you want to call it. How do you think that the way they covered her injury during that snatch was? Like, what are your thoughts and takeaways from that?
It was bold. I mean, it was a risk, and I am curious to see how it's received in general. If you're squeamish at all about that sort of thing, just be cautious when you watch the coverage of that snatch event, because you can see what happened, and it's It's not pleasant to watch, but it is a part of the story from that year. Brooke Wells is a very well-known and successful CrossFit athlete who was in a position to have her best ever year at the games last year prior to that injury. She's also, a really close training partner and friend of Tia Claire Toomey, who's in the midst of doing this incredible and career-defining and record-breaking stuff of her own, and that did have an emotional effect on her that season, which is also, an opportunity for people to see that. So, it's a risky decision. I can understand why they made it. I would have been understanding if they didn't. I don't want to say that it was the right or the wrong thing to do, but I do think the way that they covered that in general gives a little bit deeper understanding of the impact that an injury like that can have on other people besides just Brooke, which is a nice little touch that they were able to highlight in that part of the film.
Earlier, you mentioned Jason Hopper, and you think that maybe he should have had more of a story. But are there any other athletes that you think should have had a deeper storyline, or that we should have highlighted to really get the full picture of the 2021 games?
I mean, it's always tough, right? You have a limited number of cameras, you have a limited number of resources to cover these athletes, and you have to make decisions. And I know that the people that film these movies pride themselves on making decisions that they think are going to be best in terms of covering athletes that they're expecting to do well when things are finished at the end of the weekend. But it's something that Dave talked about. Like the format has become predictable, and if you like the format, which is following the top athletes event by event and getting the perspective from the athletes, and then also members of CrossFit HQ, sprinkled in there in between. This is a really, really, really well done movie. The cinematography, the videography, all the effects and everything, it's very, very masterclass. But I'm looking for something more creative. And I thought that with the title of Next Gen, one of the things that we might see was a little bit more creativity, a little bit more, diversion from that normal setting. You don't see, we already mentioned Gabby and Haley and Jason. You don't see hardly anything about BKG. You don't see very much about Saxon Panchik at all. You don't see Lazar Jukic, who is, very much in the running for Rookie of the Year with Mal coming into the last day. They were in a very similar position, and neither one of them could have gotten it. And he's, an up-and-comer in the sport, very much like Guy is. He's a few years older, so is he next gen? Maybe not, but, he did almost as well as him and just won a semifinal like he did, and who knows what's this year, so maybe a little missed with not having Lazar. But there's so many athletes that are good. You can't tell every story. I think that, along this lines, one of the kind of interesting things or weird things to me was that they showed the Bethany, Carrie, and Danielle's, problems with COVID early in the movie. And then, Danielle's, that was a real struggle for her throughout the film. And she's super popular, super likable, super athletic and capable athlete who knows how good she can do in the next couple of years. And even when she won event 8, the handstand walking event, they just mentioned it and showed a clip of her passing the finish line. And I thought missed an opportunity to check back in with her, not just then, but maybe a one or two other points as well, about how difficult that week was for her, having lost her 2 training partners, lost her 2 friends, having to be segregated from the athletes. I mean, it was a cool story in the running event about athletes who said, yeah, we'll run with her. And there was nothing of that in there. So you always have to make hard decisions about what to keep in, what to keep out. And I think that in that regard, I don't know how much time they have to work with in terms of including everything.
Could we make a 4-hour movie?
Well, I mean, that just goes back to what the coverage of the games used to be, which was the behind the scenes with Savan Matosian, where he was able to tell more storylines because he was willing to put out, multiple YouTube videos that were longer, and you could get all those different perspectives. So, including the documentary, you have to make hard choices. There's some things I would have liked to see, but they would have to be at some of the expense of some of the other stuff that was included that I'm sure other people are really happy that is in there. So I think that potentially the answer is to have that dual format where you have the documentary and the stories that you can't tell, have a couple of people that are gathering more information about more athletes throughout the games week and release that in a different version that mirrors something like the behind the scenes that can tell the stories that don't make the cut for the documentary year in and year out.
So Brian, what's your bottom line?
Bottom line is, if you're a fan of CrossFit Games documentaries historically, you're gonna really like this movie. For what it is and what their objective was with the title, I'm not so sure it was the best choices. But like it or not, it's a movie that's worth watching. there's a lot of really compelling moments. There's a lot of emotion. There's a lot of impressive performances from the athletes, which should be celebrated. There's some really good interviews with some Pat and Brent are great storytellers. They're a little bit of comedians.
Oh yeah.
You do get a lot from Tia, who is, like we mentioned, in the middle of doing this incredible thing in her career and deserves the focus and attention that she gets. They get some good stuff with Medeiros, who was the big storyline last year. So there's plenty of good. I think that maybe the title could have been saved, and there may have been something that could have focused more on either Justin's emergence or Tia's, continuing to establish her dominance, that would have just kind of better represented what the movie ended up being. But more good than bad. And I think that people will like it.
All right. We look forward to seeing it. Brian, thank you.